Hello ladies and gents, and welcome to another video of me randomly talking about something, and today it's TIE Fighter! Because of course it is. Look, I've got the shirt and everything ready to go. The reason I want to talk about TIE Fighter is because this is a retro games channel and this is my favourite retro DOS game ever, of all time. And I thought, hey, with me working on TFTC, which is the TIE Fighter Total Conversion, now would be a great time to just randomly chat about TIE Fighter in front of a 640 by 480 resolution webcam capture of my beautiful face. It's good that you don't get to see it in HD detail this time actually. I'm sparing you. To begin with, one of the obvious reasons that TIE Fighter was such a success is because it has the Star Wars license. Lawrence Holland, the creator of X-Wing and various other flight simulators, he happened upon Lucasfilm Games and was like, hey, I want to make, like, you know, a flight sims and stuff. And one of his colleagues came along and said, well, if you don't make a Star Wars licensed version of this flight sim, then I'm going to, so you better get on that. And it turned out to be a very good idea, because his previous work had mostly been World War II simulators, you know, where you're flying around as the Allies or the Nazis or whatever in old time planes, you know. And while it was good, you know, lots of people remembered the World War back in the 90s, and, you know, it had a lot of traction. It didn't have the sort of branding that Star Wars did. Star Wars just lent itself to the idea of a space combat simulator because of all these huge sort of spectacles and battles. One of the most important things that Holland learnt from doing the early World War II flight sims was that no matter what side you were on in a particular war, there were heroes on each side. They were still, you know, just men doing what they felt was necessary to preserve their life and their country. And it was difficult to sort of get that across because of how people who fought in the Second World War were viewed. And with Star Wars, you had the Empire, who, for the most part, were portrayed as these sort of villainous, British, sort of ruthless, aggressive attackers and people who would, you know, prevent freedoms and curtail everything that was good in the world and were corrupt, absolutely. And TIE Fighter took that and said, actually, that's not the case. And it was the first game to do that. It took the Empire and it said, well, sure, you know, right up at the very top, at the upper echelons, there's corruption and there's all sorts of terrible, evil sorcery going on, some kind of dark side of the Force. Oh, who knows anything about that? But the reality was that the rank and file of the Empire, the pilots and the flight officers and so on, they were just ordinary people. They weren't particularly evil, they weren't out to get everybody. They were just interested in maintaining the order of the universe. And it was only after like 10 years of Return of the Jedi that that perspective was actually dared to be shown in any form of media. And you often find that some of the best Star Wars games are the ones who subvert that expectation of what comes with the Star Wars name. And this is the very first one to do it. The other important thing about Star Wars TIE Fighter is that it wasn't a sort of one and done first venture kind of, oh, we got everything right in the first go kind of thing. Lawrence Holland had chance with his World War II flight sims to sort of figure stuff out, to go from 2D to 3D, and then he had chance to sort of dip his toe in the water with X-Wing. And X-Wing got a lot of stuff right, but it didn't get everything right. And I know there are some X-Wing aficionados who will see this and they'll be like, what do you mean X-Wing didn't get everything right? Of course it did. But no, there's a lot of stuff wrong with X-Wing, and a lot of stuff that was taken from X-Wing and further refined within TIE Fighter. So you're looking at a game where the guy had all kinds of opportunities to sort of take stuff he'd already learnt polish it up to like this super fine sheen, and the result was a very, very impressive product. TIE Fighter came out in 1994, which was when PC gaming in general really started to pick up steam, with multimedia endeavors, CD-ROM drive support, and various other things coming in and starting to become standardized. More and more people owned multimedia PCs, and as a result, the Totally Games team could expand upon what they'd already did and make it even more grandiose and incredible. And of course that was the collector's edition CD-ROM that came out the year after, where they took what they'd learned from TIE Fighter and they improved it with more voices and cutscenes and sounds and improved graphics engines and so on. Really, it was the perfect time because it was just before that 3D acceleration land. And as a result, a lot of the games from the mid to late 90s that had 3D acceleration really don't run well these days. But TIE Fighter didn't have that problem because it was all DOS based. LucasArts had had 4 years to implement iMuse to its best level, and by TIE Fighter I think it was probably the best iMuse game ever released. They had just done a brilliant job integrating the engine into such a sort of vivid flight scenario, you know, where everything was changing, you know, so quickly, and the transitions were just absolutely seamless for the most part. So much so that I haven't seen another game where the soundtrack transitions so well. And the reason for that is because it uses a MIDI score, and the MIDI score is notation based. Modern games use waveforms, and in order to transition from a waveform to another waveform there needs to be some degree of fading or audio manipulation, whilst with MIDI you are literally changing the score on the fly with the same instruments, just boom, boom, boom. And as a result, TIE Fighter had these lovely motifs that were inspired by John Williams, and they would just link together every little piece of the score. So you would have this reactive symphony in your ears that not only would serve as a great backdrop for what you were doing, but would also alert the player with regards to what was happening, what was going on, and also what kind of scenario they were in. The other thing that TIE Fighter did that we didn't see enough of, I felt, with Star Wars games, was that it incorporated the expanded universe. The Heir to the Empire books by Mr. Zahn, you know? They took the Thrawn character, Admiral Thrawn, and they gave him a starring role, basically. He was in cutscenes, he was all over the show, and as a result of that, it felt like there was a deeper universe. You weren't just on some sort of Joseph Campbell hero's journey like with all the Star Wars movies. It genuinely felt like there was a lot going on behind the scenes, and that you were just some small part of a greater whole. The detailed and interactive mission briefings of TIE Fighter also put it over the top. Like some games it'll just say, now on to level 2 or now on to level 6. And other games you'll be given like this essay's worth of text to read through and sort of prepare yourself. With TIE Fighter you had something a little different. It was a sort of halfway home between the character interaction of LucasArts' previous point-and-click adventures, and Wing Commander I guess, and the more detailed sort of briefing and analysis of those earlier flight sim games. So you had a flight officer that you would interact with and ask appropriate questions with regards to the mission at hand, and you also had this beautiful briefing board that was animated and would show you exactly what you were doing and exactly what was expected of you. The other cool thing was that if you failed the mission, which let's face it does happen, they would give you advice. They wouldn't just chastise you. They would be like, well, you know, if you do this next time, then you stand more of a chance of succeeding. And while it was a little fourth wall breaking, it was, you know, really appreciated within the context of the game, because you wouldn't have to sit and figure out what to do in the mission. You'd actually have an idea of what was going on. The other thing about the missions is that for the most part, they weren't these gargantuan sort of hour-long epics because your craft was vulnerable. Like, you didn't know if you were going to get ambushed by 4 or 5 different craft and just blown into smithereens. And as a result of that, the mission lengths were quite small. And this meant that they were replayable. And the game lent into that. Because when you failed a mission, you'd be able to go back immediately into the mission and try it again. And it was through a series of trial and error that you would learn where you needed to be, what you needed to do, and what was expected of you by the Empire. And this style of play, while seemingly frustrating to new players, meant that there was a real degree of replayability to them. Even though it was the same situation, what you did changed the mission and the outcome. And it was almost like a puzzle game in some respects, where you had to figure out, through the briefings, what exactly you had to do in order to have a positive outcome. But don't get me wrong when I talked about how difficult things could be and how you could be blown out of the sky, because one of the really good things about TIE Fighter was that it was as easy or as hard as you wanted it to be. Like, if you wanted to fly around in this sort of cinematic representation of the Star Wars universe and basically be this invulnerable god destroying everything and go on this massive power trip, you could. And if you wanted it to be an extremely challenging puzzle game, where you needed to be in the right place at the right time every single time, then you could. The game tailored itself to the style of player that you were. Whether you just wanted to fly around or whether you really wanted a challenge, TIE Fighter provided it. And it can go from being a pretty simple game to one of the most complicated and difficult games possible. But one of the great things about TIE Fighter was that it never threw a situation at you that you weren't adequately trained for in the first place. In addition to all the missions, you had training simulations and combat chambers, which would test your flying abilities and give you simulated missions, which were entirely different from the actual campaign, so that you could learn the ins and outs of the craft that you would be flying before having to fly them for the Empire. And it meant that there was a meta game of preparation with regards to the campaign missions. And that was actually emphasized by the flight officer, who would often tell you, time to brush up on your training, you know? It made you feel like you were in an actual Imperial concourse, training and learning and growing as a pilot. And that was one of the better things about TIE Fighter with regards to how the pilot was presented. At the beginning, you're just some nobody, and they pretty much infer that. They tell you, don't touch anything. It's one of the first things you learn. It's like, don't touch anything. And then the first mission or so, you're basically told, right, fly around, you know, just do your job, and all that's expected of you is that you can control the craft adequately. There's no great lofty goal. You're not treated as some hero. You're just another random Imperial pilot in an entirely disposable craft. Over the course of the campaign, the demeanor of the flight officer and the Secret Order officer changes, as does the demeanor of everyone else around you. You go from being a nobody to being an effective pilot that they respect, to being a one-man killing machine, to the point where there was one mission you flew in, and they said, well, we were expecting reinforcements, but just one craft? And you almost feel like telling them, yeah, just one craft, but it's me. And those missions, while being exceedingly difficult, are also very fun, because it has been a gradual progression that you've been guided through gently as the game ramps up in difficulty. And that is highlighted by the medals that you're awarded and the general progression of the character. And finally, the last thing about TIE Fighter that has to be sort of pointed out, there's over 100 missions, and each of those missions is scripted, and each of those missions is fully voiced. In a world where people focus on multiplayer so much, and the single player campaign is done in a few hours and serves as a primer for what the game is, the idea that there would be no multiplayer whatsoever, and the entire game would be this huge campaign that would last for hours on end. It was a beautiful thing to behold, and it allowed for callbacks to previous missions and previous characters that you'd interacted with. You'd remember certain ships and certain admirals, and there would be something going on in the back of your head where you'd remember the story beats and the plot elements, and it would almost be like an interactive novel in some ways. The original base campaign had 7 battles, and then it was expanded with Defender of the Empire and Enemies of the Empire even further, to the point where there were 13 battles. Each of the battles contained between, 4 to 7 missions. And then you had the training missions for each craft. It was an enormous endeavour to include that many missions in a game. It was an enormous endeavour, and it stands apart from most other campaigns even to this day. The only one that really compares to it are the free space campaigns by Volition. And those are just some of the reasons I like TIE Fighter. Stick around in the future if you enjoyed me rambling about this sort of thing, because I will be doing more of these, just talking about TFTC, I think, in the future. But thanks for watching, and check out all my other videos if you want to see more. Toodle pip.